All right. Most everybody's in here. We got a good amount of people. So let's get started. So thank you for joining me today. This is often a boring topic, but one that always comes up with questions from angles you don't expect. So we help founders through a variety of our products, our support ecosystems, and they always end up asking questions about ownership, but they're usually asking them at points in time where they haven't really understood the totality of what actual ownership in a company means. So we're actually going to spend the next hour together getting super nerdy about this. This isn't a high inspirational, disrupt the creative destruction status flow with your startup. This is literally how does ownership work? Who owns what of a company? What does that and what rights does that give them? And why does it exist in the first place? And we're going to go through all the possible roles from founders to advisors, contractors, and eventually those early investors. So let us jump right in. And you should be able to see my screen. Can somebody give me a thumbs up if that's working since I don't have a co-host here? You can do it in the chat. Should say managing early equity. Nice. Thanks, Steve. Steve, you are my companion. All right. So managing early equity. Be fair, protect your company, reward your teammates, don't screw up your cap table. So, before one of our principles at Gust is to always lead with value first because being a founder is tough. Usually don't have the resources. If you're a founder in our ecosystem, chances are you're not sitting on deca millions of dollars and you can just fund your entire startup yourself. You're considering fundraising, bootstrapping, a combination of both. So we want to give as much tools as we can to founders for free, and we built a recent one. We're going to talk a lot about governance today and ownership and shareholders, and we have a free tool called our Startup Corporate Diligence Report that will actually ask you about your corporate history and what you've done so far and give you feedback from the eyes of investors if you're going after investors or just a general good corporate health check. So we're going to be focusing in on the ownership part of it today. This will cover a bit more than that, all the governance structure, which are directors, officers, and shareholders, but open it in a new tab. Please don't ignore me, but check it out in your own time. It's free. It'll give you detailed assessments of where you're at. And we have a couple other tools we'll share throughout the presentation. And today is a fun one because I get to be the reverse sponsor. So every Thursday at 2 p.m., we do an event, usually with our partners over at Forecaster, but they're having an office hour. They're having an offsite this week. So their whole team is out somewhere very nice, I hope, really building their company enthusiasm and connecting with each other. So normally we're doing their content or joint content, but I still get to share. They offer a 20% discount for everybody in our Gust community. So whether you're in Mission Control, Gust Launch, or you just joined Gust organically, you can still redeem that offer. There's a QR code there for that. If you don't happen to take a snap at it, we'll send all these materials out afterwards. And to anybody asking, we do record this. We will share a recording, a follow-up. All these resources and stuff will be emailed out to you um, probably tomorrow, maybe Monday, depending on if Mitch is available tomorrow. But check out Forecaster. Forecaster is basically guardrails built around a spreadsheet and tools to help you financially model and build your projections for your startup. We use them ourselves. We love them. We've been partners with them for almost 3 years now because they have the same methodology that we do. Is one, leading with value first. They have a ton of free templates and resources out there to help you get started financially modeling if you're early. And two, they're trying to do something similar to what we do, which is grab the stuff that bigger companies have that gives them advantages and give it to startups. So in our case with Gus Launch and Mission Control, it's all about the insight, easy corporate structure, making the good decisions early, even though you probably haven't done this before. With Forecaster, it's all about financial modeling. So you could do it in a spreadsheet, and you probably should do it in a spreadsheet if you're super early, but eventually that gets unwieldy, and they have tools that are built around it, and they're pretty great tools, and they're really mission aligned with what we do. So if you're at the point where you need a financial model, check them out. They're pretty great. All right, let's dig in. So what is ownership? This is one of the most easily confusing questions we get all the time from founders. And the real answer is ownership is only ever based in a moment in time. Like a lot of founders will come out and they'll be like, well, I need to own 80% of my company. And so they think about their ownership as being 80% in some perpetuity. But really what ownership is shareholders. There's a denominator out there somewhere, and that denominator is set, what they often call the issued and outstanding shares. And it changes every time new shares are issued. So common stock is the most common. It's the most common. It's the security that you will own when a company is brand new. So most companies start with just one share class available. It's called common stock, and it's one vote, one share. And if you issue one share to yourself, you own 100% of the company. Even though you may have incorporated the company in Delaware, as we recommend, with 10 million authorized shares, those authorized shares are not the denominator of the company. You don't own 1/10 millionth of the company. If there's only one share outstanding, you own 100% of the company. If you issue another share to somebody else, you own one, they own one. The total outstanding is two shares. So one share represents 50% of the company. So you each own 50% of the company. So that is it. And at any given point, that is what ownership is determined by. It's kind of a mind game because a lot of times people try to do the math to be like, oh, I want to give somebody a 0.5% of the company, and they do the math based on how much of the shares are already issued. And it's usually always off because you have to account for the fact that by the act of issuing it, you're also increasing the denominator. So there's a formula that we'll get into later. We'll show some examples of that. And so at the moment, common stock is the only stock that has voting rights in his ownership. There's other things out there, stock options, convertible notes, safe, that imply a future ownership, but they don't mean now ownership. Somebody who holds a stock option in your company does not vote for your company. If they exercise that option, that exercise act is them purchasing common stock, and then they end up a shareholder just like you. Same thing with convertible notes and safes, and we'll get into the details later. And the biggest thing that founders get worried about when they start setting up their company is this fear of dilution. Like, how do I make it so that I don't get diluted? You're going to get diluted. That's the name of the game in here, is you're building a shared enterprise. The entire structure of Delaware C Corp's shareholders, officers, and directors is purposely designed over thousands of years to make fair compensation to a shared enterprise make sense. And in the early days, the early years, you're going to own so much of your company that it's never going to be an issue of who controls the company. But over time, as you take people's money, as you have people join your team, as you incentivize people, you're eventually going to lose ownership of that. But the whole goal is you're going to own a smaller part of a much, much bigger pie. So you shouldn't fear dilution. You should just be judicious about dilution and understand the controls and mechanisms you have during your journey to be sure you maintain the relevant amount of ownership necessary for the point in time of the company. Over here is a chart that we actually build up over thousands of companies and over a decade of stats about the general average amount of ownership the investors versus the founding team has as the company grows from the brand new idea stage, which is start, all the way to Series B, which by the time you're in Series B, you've raised tens of millions of dollars, you have significant influence on your board, shareholders, et cetera. That's when you might find the founding team starting to slip into the minority stake. But there's so many people involved in the company at that time, and there's so many incentives, for the company to make good decisions that it's not a huge deal to be a minority shareholder in a much, much bigger company that's probably worth hundreds of millions of dollars by then. So your shares are still worth way more than they were worth back in this persist and accelerate stage. You just don't have the ability to do fiat decrees. And that makes sense because there's shareholders. There are people whose interests are involved in the nature of the business. And hopefully, if you've been good, those shareholders are people you like that help you strategically, that help you keep building that company and making that pie as big as you can. So here's kind of a breakdown. This is one of our tools. We have a free cap table management tool at equity.gust.com, and you can do some modeling. But I just used a bit of the tool to show what dilution commonly looks like in a company that's making some progress. Up top here, you have the early days where the common stock you would assume is just the founding team, 2 to 3 shareholders. They own the vast majority of the company. And in this case, this company has an equity incentive plan. Kind of rare for an early stage company, but I wanted to use it to demonstrate what other kinds of shareholders there are. You usually don't adopt an equity incentive plan until after a funding round or significant growth. We'll get into that in the future as well. But you can see the common stockholders have a huge chunk of the company, and this divides out between the equity incentive plan that's actually issued and the ones that are hanging out unissued, ideally for future employees. You go through a bunch of funding rounds and conversions and things like that, but after your first price round, your cap table might look at a high level more like this. The founding team here has diluted themselves down to 72% because they had safes that they signed with pre-seed investors. They had different kinds of safes they had decided. They expanded the option pool in part of that funding round, and they raised a new series of funding at the bottom here to brand new investors. And you can see how the dilution plays out. So you see founding team still here. This is probably a typical Series A-ish, maybe seed plus round. Still has that option pool out there, but here's all the investors, and that dilution is kind of expected, and these numbers aren't, too ridiculous. So let's focus in on the founding team. What kind of ownership do they get? Usually it's the first significant chunk of equity issued. The easiest story to tell is, 2 to 3 people come together, roughly at the same moment. They say we're gonna build a company together, and I'm bringing this to the table, you're bringing that to the table. It's my idea and I'm essential. You're just a contributor. You have the conversation, and you decide 40% for so and so, 20% for so and so, X% for somebody else. You make all those grants and you do everything you can to make that happen. That usually isn't always the way it is. Most founding teams aren't set at the start. Sometimes it's, two kids right out of college, they get into an accelerator and they can have that conversation, within a week. Most of the time, it's not that, right? It's a solo founder for a year and a half working at a side job, quits their job, decides to go full time, meets somebody significant in the process of sharing their idea and says, oh, this might be a co-founder. But like, how fair is that if they've been building it a year and a half? If they're essential and the other person's a builder and not necessarily a domain expert, it can get complicated. So the best thing to do is give yourself flexibility. Like I said before, if you follow the standards, you're going to have 10 million authorized shares in Delaware. You're going to issue some amount of them to the founding team. It's best to do between 6 and 8 million, because you're going to be the majority shareholders. That leaves you enough room to just kind of plan for whatever happens. You find a third co-founder 6 months in. They're not huge stake, but they're super, they super added into the venture. They're worth 5% equity. You'll have that room to grant them that without having to go to the state and do a bunch of paperwork and things like that to get more shares to be able to grant and rebalance your cap table. What you'll find throughout this presentation is granting common equity is indelible for the most part, and you should treat it as such, other than one key element, which is vesting, which we'll get into soon. But do not think about these things as things you can easily move around because you don't want to transfer shares in between people. There's a lot of tax consequences. The idea here is you're doing this judiciously and you're putting thought into it. And there's some controls that will help you rebalance things, but you want to give yourself enough flexibility. And to start out, the best thing is if you're uncertain with who the founding team is, if you're like a solo founder, but you really want a co-founder, veer towards the 6 million. That just gives you more. You got 4 million more shares out there that you can grant. So if you meet somebody who needs a double-digit share percentage, you can still do it. If you have to adopt an option pool, before a funding round, you can still do it. If you meet advisors and contractors and people that you want on board for small slivers of equity, you have enough room. If you're pretty set, it's three of you, it's make or break, it's do or die, maybe more towards the 8 million on that spectrum. But one thing is don't get hung up on the number. A lot of share counts end up being like, I have, 4,323 shares in this company. Why? Just because when we made the choice and we did the math, that's what it turned out to be. Don't fixate on the share count itself. It's the ownership that it represents at the point in time for the company, and give yourself enough room. So this is actually a screenshot of Gus Launch. This is a product we have that actually incorporates you in Delaware, completely manages your company digitally. So you appoint your board, you appoint your officers, you do all your share granting. We have all the common stock grants that you need, all the common contracts, stock grants, NDAs, contract agreements, advisory agreements, safes, and convertible notes, and it makes running a C corp kind of a breeze. Traditionally, you'd have to pay a lawyer like 5 grand to do this, and they give you all the templates, and they would say, "Rest assured, this is what's happening. Yes, you're going to own 70% of the company because if you sign this, and the 4,233,123 shares you own represents X% of the company right now. Trust me, I'm a lawyer." Our software makes that all pretty easy to do. And you can see here, this is the example I was running through before. One share is 100% of the company. This bar chart doesn't even fill up because one share out of 10 million is a tiny little sliver. Like I said before, but if you granted one share to each, now it's 50%. Your outstanding shares is two. That is the entire ownership of the company, and there you two are. Big caveat, don't do that. Only because of an esoteric tax rule with the state of Delaware and most states that have C Corps. But if you're going to be a C Corp, chances are you want to be in Delaware. Um, each year after you establish a C Corp, you have to file what's called franchise taxes. It's 25% of the state's revenue, but what it gives access to is Delaware's courts, the backing of the state of Delaware. Should stuff happen, and it is the number one most trusted state, pretty much in the world, definitely in the United States, because they have the biggest body of case law and precedent that gives investors and all the people that contribute to a shared enterprise the confidence that if good stuff happens, they will fairly and equally be compensated for it through their efforts, either monetarily, sweat, or both. So Delaware is the name of the game, but they require you to file franchise tax every year. That is in addition from your income tax that you'll file for the corporation or your basically your corporate tax. And franchise tax is not scary. It's minimally just about $400 a year for any company that has more than 1,500 authorized shares, which you'll want that 10 million because you need to make very small grants with vesting schedules over time, which we'll get into a little bit. But if you issue a tiny amount of your authorized shares, like less than 5 million in the first year, your franchise taxes will just creep up into the thousands when it should just be $400 for the first 3 to 4 years of your company. So don't be super cute about it. Issue over 5 million to the founding team, even if it's just you, but give yourself the flexibility based on what you think the composition of your team is going to be going forward. So this is a more typical issuance. You'd see this is kind of your classic company. We caution, do not just 50-50 it. Do not hand wave it. Have the conversation with your co-founding team. And it's more common that one person is probably the majority shareholder or close to it. You can see Iris co-founder, which is my cat, is 57% of this company. I'm on board for 35%. And Tina Tech Lead is probably somebody who is what I would call a founding team member, but not a co-founder. Somebody who is there in the beginning, super important, but not necessarily the lifeblood and the DNA of what the venture is meant to be. But they're taking a big risk. They're going at it full time with you. They're just maybe more of a commodity skill set, like an engineer that isn't in love with your domain, but is in love with you and your idea and is totally going to work for you for free. And they deserve a substantial chunk of the upside because they're going to sweat for this just like you are. They just not be the special sauce. All right. Oh, look at this. I'm finally getting better at promoting our own products. Seeing that interface and the easy to do stuff. And Mercy in the in the chat, I see yes, a lawyer quoted you 18K for a C Corp and safe round. Yeah, that's the kind of figures we're talking about. One of our other presentations is like save 20 to 30K in corporate cleanup and just table stakes stuff by using Gus Launch. So if a C Corp is in your future, check us out. We are honestly the most complete end-to-end digital cap table, all the agreements you need. We've got thousands and thousands of customers. They love us. It's easier than like stringing together Carta with your own legal documents and paying a paralegal. It's easier than going with cap table over here, incorporation from LegalZoom, etc. It's all in one place where your registered agent will take care of you. And this whole bulleted list of stuff that you're going to have to eventually do within the first 2 to 3 years, we make it a click next to continue kind of experience. And there's a lot of guardrails around it. So you can't make silly mistakes. I'll tell you one of the silly mistakes a lot of founders make if they do it themselves when we talk about vesting in just a little bit. So, how do you actually have that conversation? We know the mechanisms. We know that we're going to issue between 6 and 8 million of our shares, but who gets what? Um, and the really important thing is here is having the real conversation between the co-founding team. Uh, I find it often that that are coming from corporate jobs, they worked in tech, they think of themselves as a technology forward person. They read Wired, they read Fast Company, they're up to date on startups, they're early adopters to their products. They have technical skills. They often overemphasize their importance in a startup. Because there is something of commodity skills out there where you can buy software engineering talent who can build requirements if you can give them requirements. What you can't find on the open market is often the special thing that is going to make your company valuable and innovative and different. So oftentimes you'll find founding teams come together. The classic example is the hacker and the hustler. So the person who writes the code or builds the product or works on the physical part of the product or the engineer, and the person who goes and sells it, talks to investors, talks to customers, deeply knows what it needs to look like, what it needs to be called, how to brand it, etc. Often the weight between those roles is a bit more towards the hustler than the hacker. So having the conversation and really laying out what everybody's bringing to the table and clearing the expectations. So expectations are big. I think the three biggest ones that are easy to hand wave is how full time are you working on this? Are you putting your own money into it to just make it work during the miracle era, which is like, just making miracles happen, putting a grand into the company to pay for some Google ads, to pay for that AWS bill, whatever. This isn't investing like, as an investor, but you're just putting money in for day-to-day operations. And what did I say? Working full time, putting your money in, and what is it? Oh, getting compensated yourself, taking a salary or not taking a salary. Those are big dimensions that sometimes founding teams don't really talk about as much as they should because it significantly changes the weighting of who owns what. And the biggest thing you want to do is avoid reshuffling. Like I said, you don't want to be moving shares in between two people, even if you're aiming it, if like the realization is like, oh, we're completely unbalanced, like you should owe 20% more of this company than me. What you don't want to do is be in the position of, oh, we're still moving forward on this, but now we have to go and talk to a lawyer to figure out how to move those shares or to grant more shares or to do an amendment. You want to avoid reshuffling because doing it naively without support, like either from us or lawyers, puts you into tax hell and you'll end up building like an uninvestable company because of just like unforced errors. Or you're just going to pay a bunch of fees to clean things up. So there is a thing out there if you're not ready to, put the stake in the ground with the Delaware C Corp and have a real entity that you're going to have to take care of. There's something out there called the Founders Accord by a good friend of ours. Let's see if this actually works. Charles McCormick. This is a lightweight agreement ahead of time that basically says, hey, we're two, three, four individuals. We're going to go after a big idea. And it has the potential to turn into something, a startup. And if we turn it into a startup, this is how things are going to go down. It's worth considering if you're in that kind of idea stage. It's not essential, but definitely something that can help founding teams get aligned. Da, 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 da. Can somebody give me a thumbs up in the chat if the share has returned to its full screen? I'm going to trust that it does, but if somebody could let me know, because I sometimes switching tabs messes things up. But check that out. We love Charles too. He's a good guy. And we actually have free tools. So we have something, I'll type it in the chat right here while you guys take a look at that. We built a free tool called the Co-Founder Equity Split Tool because we found so many founders were either not having the conversation or having the conversation without even knowing all the things that go into it. So if you go to cofounders.gus.com, you can add all the people that you're considering joining your venture in the early days. And I would even add people that you're not even sure if they're a co-founder because the questions that we will ask you through the tool and we'll have you weight each other in relation to your skills, not as like an arbitrary absolute scale, which is actually very helpful. The questions it will ask you will kind of force that conversation, even if you don't know all the angles of contribution that actually go into a startup. So you can see here, this is just six or so working full time, taking a salary, providing direction, fundraising preparation, building the product, etc. Um, and I will say, I think there's like 40 or 50 of these questions. So it really gets in depth and it will actually give you a recommended split at the end of it. And managing budget and forward pays for out-of-pocket expenses, pitches to investors. A lot of these answers can significantly switch what makes sense. And we built this again based off of thousands of companies and their splits that have actually moved beyond, just kind of the idea stage. And this is what the result will actually be. It'll not just be recommended splits. This company is actually surprisingly even. I should probably go through this again to weight it a little bit less. But still, there's a majority shareholder, and the differences in these percentages are important. It seems silly sometimes, but what you don't want is basically what's called corporate deadlock, which is the organization cannot move forward on a technicality unless, some resolution is made. And usually that means litigation. Like if literally you're 50-50 and your co-founder says X and you say Y and you can't reach agreement, there's no way for the organization to move forward without resorting to getting lawyers involved. And you don't want that situation. So even if it seems super even, often you want somebody who is the majority shareholder, even if it's by just a couple percentages. And what's kind of cool about this tool is based on your answers and your weighting, will give you some custom feedback. It's not as deep as the corporate diligence tool. That one really took that one to town. But it's quite helpful to explain it amongst yourselves. And what's cool about this tool is you can run it through yourself. I suggest if you can get everybody in the room to sit down and go through it together and actually talk about, the weightings that you're giving each other, that's the healthiest way. But we're remote, people are busy. What you can do is if you go through it yourself, rating your co-founders, you can invite your co-founders to it and they can go through it themselves and you'll eventually get an amalgamated split based on what everybody says. And you can each take your results and say, hey, this is mine. When I did it, it said 37% for me. When you did it, it said 32. What did you answer differently? Where is your expectation? Oh, you didn't think that I was going to be crucially involved in the fundraising process? Well, I totally think I will be. And that's a healthy conversation to have, especially before you make too many commitments. And um, again, getting better at pitching our own products. If we've gotten this far, we're 26 minutes into it, and I'm saying a lot of stuff, right? Authorized shares, equity splits. We haven't even gotten into vesting yet. Why Delaware, 10 million. Um, there's a lot of terminology that goes into running a startup that has almost nothing to do with making a successful startup from a product standpoint. Usually, what's important from a product standpoint is building something people want. And that's probably what drew you to being an entrepreneur in the first place. You are less interested in Delaware corporate law and the Court of Chancery. You're more interested in building something that changes the world or helps somebody's situation or is meaningful to you and you think has a lot of commercial value to it. That's what we love about entrepreneurs. That's what we love about founders. But we know that in order to make those things actually successful, commercially successful, investable, all that hard effort and all that work plumbing into a shared enterprise, humanity has come up with corporate entities that reflect those kind of rules. And they're actually not easy to understand, but they make sense once you sit in it long enough. And we've been sitting in it for more than a decade. So we have actually made a program that helps founders out on a weekly basis that meets them where they're at, that doesn't take any ownership in their company, that is dirt cheap. It is not thousands of dollars like an accelerator program or literally millions of dollars in equity if you're actually successful, like something like a Techstars or Y Combinator. They provide a ton of support. It's kind of like a crucible, but they take 6 to 7% of your company, which if you're successful, that ends up being one of the most expensive transactions you ever do. Mission Control tries to meet everything in the middle, meet founders where they're at, give them this kind of expertise and support on a regular, literally weekly basis, and unlock, progress for them. It's a super cool program. We're a year into it. We've been having fantastic results in it, including people who go through the program and then eventually get invested through our own angel group or through people in our network, because they unblock themselves and they figure out the hard answers to the hard questions out there, and they keep making progress. So check it out. It's a great program. We love running it. There's content like this, but it is not a webinar from me to all of you with full control, but literally all of our faces are on there every week. We're answering questions, we're digging deep. We're not lawyers, we're not going to give you legal support, but we are totally going to fill in 80% of the gaps where you would be paying $8 to $1,200 an hour for somebody just to educate you on why you want to file an 83B election or why Delaware. We'll fill all that in for way cheaper and at a scale that makes sense. And you don't have to be a Harvard dropout that can give up 3 months of your life to go move to Silicon Valley and nose to the grindstone for 3 months. We can actually help founders in many other situations because of the way we approach the program. So check that out. Back to it. I'm very proud of myself for actually promoting my own products in my own free webinar for once. How common stock vesting works. So I've talked a little bit before about this. So say you have the conversation, you've got the founding team together, you agree, I'm 60%, you're 30%, you're 10%. Things change. And sometimes they change because things don't work out. Other times they change because you just don't expect things. And the best way I try to put this into founders' heads is like, imagine the happy change or the amicable change. Don't prepare for conflict, just prepare for change. You go heads down, say it's just you and a co-founder. You're 60-40. It makes total sense. You're down 3 months into it. You're really excited. And now that co-founder one day gets a phone call and they've got a sick parent. And they're like, you know what? I only got one mom in my life. I can't do this. I can't give myself 110% to this company when I want to go and spend more time with my parents because this could be the last time. So I'm sorry. I love what we were doing. Maybe we'll get back to it. Maybe I'll join you at your Series B, but I just can't give the level of effort a company takes. And it is, it's your vital energies is what it's going to take. And so now they leave the company. If they have 40% of the company, that is a dead company. Anybody that you talk to, an investor joining somebody else, it's like, why does this person have so much of the company? They're not even here. They only worked here for 3 months. That's called dead equity. And you want to avoid it as much as you possibly can. That's not to say you don't want someone owning a percentage of your company not being there anymore, but you want to be sight unseen, chest poundingly verified that what they own, even though they're not here, is totally worth what they contributed to the company. And when you're in the early days, there's a long way to go for that contribution to be worth even 10%, even a whole 1%. So how do we protect against that? Like I said before, transferring shares in between people blows them up. It messes up their tax status. It makes your cap table very complicated. It puts tax consequences in the now, which generally in the first 3 to 4 years of a startup, like you don't want to deal with any kind of tax complications. You're generally in the red. You're not paying corporate taxes because you don't have huge revenues or you're spending way more money than you're making, and you want to avoid any sort of income recognition until like things are pretty clear. You have a sustainable or a growing business that makes sense. So there is something called vesting. Lots of you might have heard of vesting if you worked in technology companies as stock option vesting, even if you work in a public company, right? You go and work at Boeing. Stock options will be part of your, compensation plan, right? You'll get X amount, et cetera. That kind of vesting is the right to purchase. So what they're saying is if you stick with the company for X amount of time, every year, every month, you will get the right to purchase more shares of the company at a given price set when you entered the company. For brand new tech startups, It is not actually options that you're receiving as the founding team. You are receiving direct common stock in the company. And that means you own your votes now. So when you grant yourself, 4 million shares that represents 60% of the company, you own 60% of the company and 60% of the votes. So if a shareholder vote needs to happen, like you are the majority shareholder there. However, you don't want to own that in perpetuity in case good or bad things happen, you need to leave the company. So that's why common stock vesting is technically called reverse vesting. It is not the right to own the shares, but rather it's the irrevocability of the company being able to take them back should you leave. Upon your termination is the official word for it, but termination sounds scary, terminators, but it could be, you choose to leave or somebody pushes you out of the company, usually in the case of a minority shareholder where the directors or the majority shareholder said like this relationship just isn't working. Reverse vesting is very useful because the IRS, by default, considers those vesting schedules. And vesting is, again, the right for the company to repurchase, not the right for you to purchase those shares. So, in my hypothetical situation, if I'm a co founder working really hard 3 months, I got, say, 40% of the company, it's on a vesting schedule that has a cliff, which we'll get into in a second, of 1 year and a full schedule of 4 years. That means that I will not have the irrevocability of all my shares until the end of 4 years. And for the first 12 months, I don't have any of them yet until I hit that milestone. And that's basically like a proving period to be sure that the relationship is working. If I leave after 3 months, what the company can do automatically without I've already pre-agreed to this, is basically say, hey, sorry, it didn't work out. We're basically terminating this relationship as you as a co-founder, and we get to buy back all of the shares that we gave you. So that 40% literally just goes straight back into the company, completely protected for taxes, and you don't have any debt equity on your cap table. That is not to say you'd be a jerk about things. You might say, hey, those 3 months were great. We're going to terminate you, pull back all your shares, but we're just going to grant you, 30,000 shares for your efforts and contributions. No vesting schedule. Those are just yours. It's totally worth, you really were you're putting the work in, you're doing 80-hour weeks, it was your life and your passion. It's just changed. So don't get too worried that you have to plan for everything, but it's just what you really want to do is protect company ownership so that nobody ends up with a significant chunk who's actually not doing the work for it. So, what do they generally look like? The most common schedule is 4 years, like I mentioned, with a 1 year cliff. Occasionally, there's what's called double trigger acceleration put on the founder grants. To be honest, it's not that important and don't wring your hands too much about it. It takes a long time to build a startup. So if you're in year 4 and you're considering like an acquisition and you're worried about acceleration, what acceleration is as an uncertain at certain transactions, you can actually immediately vest the remaining parts of your company. So, say we start a company together, I own 60%, you own 40%. We sell it in 2 years, right? Industry crazy story. I think it's happened once with Instagram, which was like a less than 2 year sale or something like that. If that does happen, a sale is considered a liquidity event. So basically, your shares would be converting into the acquiring entity's company, and they're going to pay cash for it. So if you have unvested shares at that transaction point, double trigger acceleration basically says, all right, if we get acquired while I'm still vesting, and I get removed from the acquiring entity on amicable terms, I can vest the rest of my shares and basically cash them out. What this is designed for is what would be called a soft landing. You build a super valuable company, a huge incumbent buys it. You get made redundant within 6 months because they already have, huge departments and things like that that can run all your jobs. And you're an entrepreneur. You want to go start another company. They say, hey, great, we're fine dismissing you. And yeah, all your shares accelerate. You're fine. In the vast majority of cases, nobody sells their company in 4 years or even 6 or 7 or 10 now. It's getting longer and longer. So don't worry too much about the acceleration. It comes more into play usually with advisors, which we'll get to in a second. But the most common 4 years overall schedule, 1 year cliff. And how to think about setting them up is really lining them up with, how the amount of time you can recognize the value. That's the default. If like two founders come together, giving it basically the same efforts, is 4 years, 1 year. If things are a little different, be a little different, right? If your co-founder is somebody you absolutely trust and love, but they have a mortgage or they have kids and they like, I can't go full time until we raise some money, or I can't go full time until we have some revenue. So I'm gonna like go part time at my work, or I'm gonna do consulting on the side. So you're full time, they're half time. You might want to move that cliff a little bit or extend that vesting period to make it make sense. If they say, hey, after 6 months, I think I can then go full time, maybe it's an 18-month cliff, just so that, you get enough time to see them both in the part-time capacity and in the full-time capacity. And then it makes sense that they're bringing that recognized and quantifiable value based on their situation. You really want to demonstrate it's in it. Huge question. If I'm a solo founder, why would I do a vesting schedule? Who's going to fire me? It's really good to do it anyway, because one, exactly that. Who's going to fire you? You're not going to terminate yourself for the company if you're the only person in it. So the vesting schedule is not going to harm you at all. But what it demonstrates to anybody else that joins the company, whether financially, like just an investor, or maybe a new co-founder or a team member, is that you are holding them yourself to the same agreements that you are going to put on them. So it is a very good practice. Investors are going to force you to put it on yourself anyway if they put money into your company because they want to know that you're in it and you're committed. So there's really no harm in doing it. We have founders in Gus Launch all the time. If you turn off vesting to your own stock grant, a big red window show pops up that says, "Are you sure about that?" Like it is overwhelmingly standard and really costs you nothing to do this. Like you can always take it off if you are, a super powerhouse, and by the time you raise funds, you can say to investors, you know, I'm the big baller here. I don't need vesting anymore. I gave this my all. I'm not leaving it. And you convince them, great, you can just take it off. But when you're just getting started, put a standard vesting schedule on your stock grants, even if you're a solo founder. A little bit of wrinkle of the times. Companies are staying private for far longer. Do not be scared of revesting or longer vesting schedules. If you have a conversation with investors and like, we'd really like you to have a new 4-year vesting schedule on your founder shares, once we put our money in, don't feel like they're really trying to take you to the cleaners or anything like that. It is in their best interest that if you are that important to the company, you are incentivized to stick around. So don't be too scared of that. And don't try to get cute. Don't try to make like milestone-based vesting schedules with, shipping a product by this for co-founder X or, bringing qualified leads for co-founder Y. It sounds really cool. And it's actually a really good way to think and talk about your team about what is worth their ownership in the company and what kind of output you expect from them. But if you try to cram it into contract law, you're just going to spend thousands of dollars with lawyers and things are always going to change and it's just not worth the hassle. Put generous time windows on it so that it makes sense. You can evaluate performance and you can always readdress it, right? If you have to terminate someone and bring them back in a completely different role, way easier to do it with the standard tools than just constantly amending and amending documents based on market switches, people's availability, the product pivots. Now it's not a freemium product, it's a pay up front. So many things are going to change in the first 4 to 5 years of your company. Don't get cute with the contracts because it's just way more time than it's worth and lawyers are expensive. This is kind of a visualization of how you can think of a vesting schedule every month. Monthly is most common, hard to argue with time. And this is again from our cap table and equity planning tool. But you can see eventually when you climb up to owning the full share count that you were initially granted. And this looks like 2 years left in this schedule. All right. So hopefully I've convinced you all that you should put vesting on your grants no matter what. Um, Unfortunately, once I've convinced you of that, I have to tell you it does make your life a little bit more complicated. So I said before, the IRS loves this word irrevocable. In their mind, if you have shares in a if you have common shares in a C corp, you own them outright at the moment in terms of their voting and influence on the company. However, the IRS does not view them as irrevocable until the company can no longer take them back for you by dismissing you. So that is what the vesting is. So by default, give yourself or your co-founders a stock grant and it's got vesting on it. The IRS will say, oh, well, so after a year, 25% of that is going to vest. And then every month after that, 1/48th of that stock grant is going to continue to invest. We, the IRS, are going to say at that point in time, the grant is irrevocable. So you have received those shares, and whatever they're worth is an income event for you. Um, that is what you don't want. In your initial grant with Gus Launch, when you incorporate a company, and this is the most common value you start the company at, it's each share is worth 0.00001 dollar, 1/10 millionth of a dollar. That is, as I put here, delightfully worthless. You could buy every single authorized share in the company, all 10 million of them, which you shouldn't do, but you could, and it would cost you $100. You would literally pay for them $100 for 10 million shares. You want that. You want the basis of your company to start out very, very low because you only have to pay $100 for it, or $60 or $40, whatever you decide your share count's going to be. The whole point of starting a startup is to make those shares worth a lot more money over the next decade. And when you get to sell them, you get the spread, right? If you started for a $60 purchase for 100% of the company, and later you sell it for $600 million, the markup between those is amazing, and you want that. However, what you don't want is 4 years along the way or 3 years along the way, as you're actually successfully growing your startup, it's going to be worth more money. So those shares are going to get marked up through a process called 409A valuations, which we'll talk about in a little bit. You don't want the IRS being like, hey, 3 years into this company, co-founder Sally is vesting 570,000 shares a month because they own, it wouldn't be that much, but it'd be like 100,000 shares a month. And now those shares are worth $1 a piece. You don't want $100,000 of income, vesting every single month. Like, you put your blood, sweat, and tears in this company. It's growing in value. That's amazing, but you're not even paying yourself a salary like that. That's ridiculous. So you don't want that to happen, but that's what the IRS does by default. So there's something called an 83B election. And this is your personal individual concern. This actually has nothing to do with the company's tax situation. The company's not going to suffer anything from this. You will just be getting a big tax bill if your company is growing well. But it is very good for companies to be very aware of this and educate not just their founding team, but anybody they grant stock to, because 83B elections in the first couple of years are always overwhelmingly what you should do. What the 83B election does is allows you, you say to the IRS, I'm going to take the taxation for me gaining these shares up front. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to forego the ability to take a loss on it in the future. The reason this makes sense for startups is because your company starts out worthless, so there's no loss to take. You're not going to care about a $60 loss over the course of 10 years. It's not going to do anything to your income taxes. Larger companies, private equity companies, companies with strong revenue from the beginning, think like a warehouse or, maybe like a services company, that might be granting more equity to incentivize employees and things like that. They might care about this being like the value of the company could go up and down, but that means there's already value established. So for pretty much anybody on this call, if you're doing a startup, you don't care about that at all. You're not going to take losses on these shares. So it's totally within your best interest to say to the IRS, hey, I'm going to take the tax hit for this upfront. Oh, hey, I paid cash for it in the same calendar year, so that tax hit is zero, and I never have to worry about this again. If my shares are worth $500 million in 10 years, I do not have any income representation of them until I sell them. And then it's capital gains. It is not regular income tax, which is usually much lower. So 83B election, almost always worth doing. You have a ticking clock, 30 days. You got to do it within 30 days of the grant date. And that's for every grant. So if you top yourself up later, if you give yourself a second grant or somebody else a second grant, you want to be sure you do the paperwork. We advise, and our platform actually fills out the form for you and tells you where to mail it to. And we give you like a ton of extra steps, like put it in a self-addressed stamped envelope, demand a receipt, be sure the IRS gets this and can get it. If you forgot to do one, there's always people that do. There are methods to get around it, but they're a pain in the ass. You have to work with a lawyer. There's like a low and slow method. There's like amend it, wait a bit, re-amend it, etc. But seek counsel if you're building a growing startup and you've never heard of the 83B election. But if you haven't granted stock yet, pretty much always do it. All right, I got to speed up a little bit, but I can hang out with you guys a little longer too if anybody will stick around. Um, I talk too much when I'm on my own. Who else gets common stock and who doesn't? All right, so we've covered the founding team, but a lot of other people. It takes a village to grow a company. So you're going to get people that come and go. You're going to get people that join in advisory capacity that later on want to work full time for you. You're going to get investors. You're going to get all sorts of things. So the most common other contributors that might get common stock, usually in the first 2 years or so, are advisors, contractors, and accelerators or incubators, which you can kind of think of as contractors in a certain way, but they're specialized. The vast majority of these people get much smaller grants. Do yourself a favor and just lock in this idea of less than 1% by default is just what you're assuming anybody who wants to help your startup that isn't a co-founder. There might be special cases that determine bigger, but it's really good. You don't want to be giving away 5% here, 3% here, 7% here. You'll end up diluting yourself and your cap table would just be untenable. Advisors typically get very small grants. Contractors fits to the scope of work. Accelerators, incubators will basically tell you what they want, and you really have to measure up what they're providing to see if it's actually worth it. You still want vesting in almost all of these scenarios. It's just a little bit more custom because it needs to fit the relationship. So let's dive into each one. Advisors. Advisors, do not confuse your board of advisors with your board of directors. Board of directors in the early days is probably just going to be you and maybe your co-founder. If you raise a significant seed round, you might have an investor join the board to represent the shareholders, but these are very small, usually odd numbers of people that don't really expand much until you're in Series B territory and you're talking with VCs. What advisors are is you want to get good advisors. They should have 2 to 3 times the experience in the network of yourself. That means they're going to add value. They're not shadow co-founders. They're people who literally a phone call, 45 minutes with them could unlock a huge network opportunity, an understanding of a domain that you're just don't have the experience in, an experience of how to, build a sales team or expand into, a different regulated industry or something like that. Heavy hitters. They generally are stage specific, so they're brought on to level a company up to the next stage, whether it's raise the next round, land a significant partnership, get into a regulated space, whatever your kind of domain is. Even though they're big heavy hitters, they generally get a fraction of a percent of equity, a tenth of a percent, maybe a quarter of a percent. There's actually one of our partners, Founder Institute, has this great thing called the FAST worksheet. It actually has a table to help you figure out what's a decent percentage, and you can see this maxes out at 1%, and that is literally the expert upon expert at the earliest stage of the company. If Snoop Dogg is coming in to advise you on your new cannabis company and it's just an idea stage, yeah, fine, 1% is fine. Anybody else, fractions of percent, and the more you make progress yourself, the more value should be accreting into the organization, and therefore even fractions of percent should be worthwhile. Do not let people run you around on this idea that advisors should get like 5% of the company because they're just so brilliant. Vesting schedules for advisors, way different. 2 years with a 3 month cliff. Two reasons. One, they're there to help you level up. Chances are, if they can't do something in 2 years, they're not really a great advisor and you should probably get rid of them. Two, you should feel that very quickly. If you bring someone on as an advisor and you have one phone call a month for 45 minutes and you get nothing out of it after 2 months, kill that relationship. That is not an advisor yet. Maybe it's not their fault. Maybe your company was just a little slower. You don't have need of their skills or something like that, but they don't deserve to have that chunk of your company until they're really, really powerhousing the advice level. And the last thing is no cash compensation. Anybody who's asking to get paid and have equity in your company for just basically being on the phone with you is not a real advisor. Chances are they're either naive about how this actually works or they're kind of running a scam or they're just trying to like grab money and equity from founders who really should be super efficient with cash at the early stage. All right, contractors. So contractors can be anybody else, but the biggest thing is you don't have a lot of money in the beginning. You shouldn't hire W-2 employees because they're expensive. You have to pay unemployment insurance, you have to do minimum wage laws, you have to file things in various states, you have to pay taxes, payroll taxes, etc. It's usually just not worth it when things are really early. So lean on contractors. Contractors do not have to be somebody who's like running a contracting thing. You can contract with somebody for 10 hours a week who's just a software engineer or just a marketing person because you can't pay them, W-2 salary or they're not full time and you're not going to give them a laptop and set their hours or anything like that. So 1099 employees get a contractor agreement in place. It's a great way to get help from qualified people who want to do something on the side or want to contribute, but know you don't have enough money and want to be an employee later. And you can also incentivize contractors with a little bit of equity when you're a startup and you don't have tons of money, often usually if somebody is startup aware, they're like, hey, I will sell my services to you at a discounted rate or possibly even free if I have some equity incentivization. Do not one-to-one the cash to equity situation. If somebody's like, I can make $300 an hour being a software engineer on the open market, therefore I'm going to help you 10 hours a week, 300 times this, that's thousands, let me buy this much equity. Don't do that. Equity is incentivization for everybody winning when the company gets much, much bigger and sells. It is not a one-to-one replacement for cash. There's so many caveats and miracles that need to happen between that. But if somebody's like, hey, I'm willing to basically work under market because I love what you're doing. I would love to have an upside in it if we succeed. My efforts are going to go towards making you successful, and I'll sell to them at cost or for free. Because if it succeeds, I want to succeed too. But don't think of it transactionally because the chances of failure are so high and they'll end up taking over your entire company if you start doing one-to-one cash things just in the early days. Again, low percentages, maybe low single digit. You can actually view accelerators, and there's a question in the chat about the YC terms I'll get to in a second. Do similar thoughts like how much value are they going to bring, and is it worth how much you're going to give away for them, and match the vesting to that. If somebody's going to build you an MVP and they say it's going to be out in 6 months, that sounds like a 7 month cliff to me because 3 months into it, if they're just not meeting the needs of the capacity that you're seeing, you don't like the quality of work, you can get all that equity back and you don't have to worry about taking that risk. and you can terminate a contractor once you have that agreement. Like anybody, same with advisors. I didn't mention this before. Get an agreement in place. When it comes to diligence, everything that you say to investors, like, "Oh, this person's advising us, and we're working with this team," they're going to want to see proof of that, and that's going to be documents. Diligence should be a box checking exercise when it comes to it, not a proof exercise or not a convincing anybody exercise. So be sure to get your contracts in place. Upsell to launch, we have contracts for all these relationships, keeps your house in order, makes life a lot easier. Accelerators. Accelerators, think of them as specialized contractors for that are very focused on what startups challenges that they run into. Accelerators are great. They're honestly becoming the earlier funding source. Commonly, they took between 4 and 7%. They've been playing with a lot of that. YC is still, as Olivia put in the channel, YC is kind of like your Harvard of accelerators. They're the pedigree. They take 7% for, I believe it's either 125 or $150,000 with the right to buy another $350,000 at the next round's terms. It's rich. It's a lot of your company to sell when you're super early. However, because they have such a pedigree, you're almost guaranteed to raise another round if you're a YC company at demo day. Like investors are like money hand over fist to these companies. So for a lot of founders who don't have other resources, it's totally worth it. For founders who do have more resources, who might be able to bootstrap themselves through that idea stage to kind of pre-seed stage, I would consider it with a bit more weight. Like that's a big chunk of your company to give up. You want to be sure the pedigree is worth it. You want to be sure the pedigree is going to add value to you. You know, I know a good friend of mine who's a founder, a second time founder. She got into YC, looked at the terms, and was like, I don't think I actually need this. Like I know everything that's in their program because I've already founded a company. I've made all the mistakes. I've watched all the things. Yeah, having the nice orange badge on my company is going to make it easier, but like I already have great relationships with investors. Like I think I can raise my seed round on my own at my own terms and not have this anchor around my neck. So it's really about where your situation is in. Yeah, I think the profile for most people who go through YC is like the college dropout, the two people who have no resources and no network. They just, they're inspired and they're engineers and they want to build. YC probably provides them tons of value worth 7% or more. But in your particular situation, you got to measure it up to your other resources that you have available and try to understand what they're actually talking about and don't just take their word for it. I know tons of people who get into both YC and tech stars who have more leverage, who are able to negotiate a slightly different deal because they have leverage, right? There are the company that goes into YC that doesn't have a product, doesn't have customers, and just starts from fresh there is very different than a customer who's already bootstrapped themselves to revenue, but could really use the advice and the network expansion from YC. So if you have some leverage, don't feel scared to use it in those conversations and understand the vehicles. Like accelerators have been trying like experimenting with all sorts of bespoke agreements. So the most common thing is a safe. If they use a standard instrument, a safe or convertible note, and you understand what it does, that's a lot easier than like custom bespoke weird warrants or things that trigger at certain times. Just be a little bit wary. Honestly, if you're getting into that situation, you have questions, come to Mission Control, email me, I'll give you a free office hours session and we can take a look at what they're offering to see if there's any weird downsides or incentive killing mechanisms around there, and definitely be wary of dilution protection. Anybody who talks about common with like you'll hear full ratchet anti-dilution protection or something like that, just a little bit of yellow flags. You want to be sure you understand what you're really getting into. I've met founders who go through an accelerator, get really excited, start building momentum, and then look at their cap table and their ownership structure and just kind of like their motivation sinks because they're like, I'm going to work this hard for another couple years and I'll be at, less than X% of my company if I get through this in the happy case. So be sure you know you're getting into. We're almost at time here. I'll try to buzz through this real quick and then I'll give you guys some extra time for Q&A because I haven't been able to track it perfectly because it's just me, but I'll give you guys that extra 15 minutes or so. All right, so we talked about basically everybody who gets common stock in your equity thing and the vesting schedules that map to them. So what goes beyond common? Talked about it right in the beginning, stock options. At some point, you're going to want a stock option plan and you want to stop giving people common shares in your company. Two big forcing factors. One is a funding round. Investors will basically insist on it. They want you to incentivize employees with options because it's what we do. It's why people join companies that go, they take an under market salary. They take a bet on a startup rather than just going to work for some big corporate. So investors will say, hey, you should have X% of your company available as options to grant to employees. Sometimes the forcing factor is either because of expenses or hassles. So as your company grows in value, eventually that you can buy 6 million shares for $60 goes away. Eventually, if your shares are worth half a dollar, and you're hiring an engineer and you're giving him 10,000 shares, right? A tiny, tiny percent of the company, but still significant to them. But then you turn around and say, oh, by the way, you got to pay me $5,000 for those. Most people do not think of paying a company to go and work for it. The nice thing about options is you don't have to spend any money. It's the right, but not the obligation to buy the underlying security with a set strike price based on when it was issued. So it's all the upside in the world for the employee. If the company grows because of their efforts and everybody else and later sells or does something like that, they can buy those shares and sell them. And that's their incentive. So sometimes you get driven to that just because the company is making progress, but they didn't need to raise funds to do it, but their value continues to go up. And options give you a lot of flexibility. I said before, it's like you don't want to move stuff around with common stock. You want to keep all the tax treatments set. Once you adopt an option plan, and we actually have one through Gus Launch, which is kind of mil spec and industry standard, it puts a lot of power in the CEO and the board's decision to cancel grants, to forfeit grants, to move things around, to do things because it's not actual security ownership underneath until they exercise them. It just makes your life less of a hassle. You have to be less indelible about options because you can always just say, when somebody leaves the company, you can make them sign something that says, I waive my right to execute them. And that's it. You don't have to worry about repurchase rights and 83B elections and all that. But they do come with some stuff to manage. So you have to set the strike price when you grant options to employees. So there's something called 409A evaluations. This is once you adopt an option plan, you need to figure out how much the strike price of those options are going to be. And so, like I said before, when you start out, the value of your shares is 0.00001. As you start to grow, you need to change that. And there's two ways. You don't change the underlying share price by raising funds from investors. You literally go and get what's called a 409A evaluation. This is a protection that came out of the Enron scandal because those executives were basically messing around with options to grab their deferred compensation and give it to themselves, knowing that the company was going to go under. So the SEC stepped in to put a stop to this. So what a 409 evaluation is generally you want to get this done from an outside provider, a bank. There's services out there that do this. It costs you like 5, 7 grand, depending on how complicated your company is. But what it does is it crams all the data that they can have about your company, even though it's early, like who owns what, if you have revenues, what your balance sheets look like, what other companies are in the space, and they model it out. They do like a Black-Scholes Merton formula, discounted cash flow, public comparables, private comparables, a little magic sauce, and they just say, your shares are worth like a quarter. But the nice thing about that, it's usually way lower than how much your company is worth to investors. It's just something that you have to do from a compliance standpoint, so you can write a number on those options that you issue to your employees. Um, don't be scared. You don't want to juice up your 409 evaluation. Actually, some companies actually fight to lower it when they get a slightly higher one back from a service provider because the gap between the option price and the value, the market value of the company is what the employee would gain. But it's really just a compliance thing to be sure you're not doing fraud. But once you set up an option plan, you have to get this updated every 12 months. So there is some additional expense for it. Again, shout out to Gus Launch. We include it in our higher tier, which is 3,500 bucks a month because we keep your company so rote standard. We control your cap table, all your agreements. We get foreign evaluations super cheap from providers, so we can pass that savings on to you because you're so mil spec and standard. Most of the expense in a foreign evaluation from the provider is getting an accurate view of the company's corporate history, and that's what our software kind of keeps in lockstep with what they're doing. So we get them cheaper. Oh, and this is kind of what it looked like from our cap table management software. You can see this company over here on the right was getting valuation increasing over the years. Honestly, way too fast. I should have spread these out by like 4 or 5 years. But as the stock price ramps up, you keep updating that. All right, hitting the finish line here. Option pools, not oceans. One of our favorite phrases we lifted from our friend Jose Ancer, who's a great startup lawyer out of Texas. Don't just get attracted to round numbers on this. You'll often hear between 10 and 15% of the company should be option pool. Yeah, between 10 and 15%. But picking that number, don't make it arbitrary. Don't just be like, they said 15, so 15. One reason, the full size of the pool will be used in the dilution of future funding rounds. So they will assume, even though they're not all issued, that basically that 10% is a fixed 10% that you don't own the company or the founding team doesn't. So you want to judiciously choose how much of your company is reserved for the option pool. Don't rely on round numbers. And the best way to do this is a financial model and look at what your hiring and staffing needs are and make a credible argument to your investors. So if investors come in and they're negotiating like, oh, we're going to buy 18% for this amount, and we expect you to have a 15% option pool, so our ownership will be this, and be like, whoa, 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 15%. Like, this is my hiring plan. Like, I'm not going to need that many people. Like, I was planning on an 8% option pool. We can always expand it later. It just gives you a little bit more bargaining power. And honestly, it's good for you to really know how you're going to put the money to use. It'll improve your pitch and it'll show you know what you're talking about. The last thing I'm actually going to skip because we have a whole presentation about convertible notes. Um, and that's it. I'm going to now do questions. That is managing early equity. All the equity concerns before you raise funds, but the people that you're going to give equity out to, as well as potentially the employees that you might hire and how you incentivize them. So I'm going to leave this up on here. Mission Control is honestly the best door into Gus to get more support, to know more about our products, to know more about how we support founders, how we help them get funded, how we support everybody else in our ecosystem. So I'll leave that up here. It's basically access to me and people like me on a weekly basis to sort through topics like this. But now I'm going to try to rip through the Q&A while you guys hang out with me. And I appreciate your patience with me running, asking, looking at chat, and all that. Do-do-do-do. Elias originally asked, do you have an ideal ranges for desired level of founder ownership by stage? Totally. I think I had that way back, and maybe I didn't throw that slide up. But the common amount is here. Usually basically getting outside of the idea stage, the pre-seed stage, as you say. You can see this is cut in half. What I would maybe call a hustle round or a party round is giving small parts of your company up to maybe some investors, some friends and family investors, maybe an accelerator. Once you actually raise a real seed round with professional investors who set a valuation, that's when you'll start to see that 10 to 20% chunk. So the most common amount of your ownership you want to sell in a funding round, a legitimate funding round, not like 25K here, 100K here, but something that has a valuation, even if it's a valuation cap, is between 10 and 20%. And it's very important that you keep in that range and you set where you're in that range based on kind of your leverage and your story. Uh, Professional investors, Shark Tank is a lot of entertainment. They do not want to buy 35% of your company in a seed round if they know what they're doing, because if you're a Shark Tank person, like your own personal brand can make the company successful and you can be greedy. But for almost every other startup, like you want the founder committed. You do not want the founder owning 10% of their company by the time they hit Series A because they're not going to stick with it. It's a lot of work to especially get, you're three miracles in by the time you're at Series A. It's a ton more work to get to the next miracle. And the smart investor will not want the founder having all the incentive in the world to give up. So generally that 10 to 20% for a funding round holds for both sides of the table. Where you sway on that is based on your traction and how good of a narrative you're selling to the investors. If you have revenue, if you have growing customers, investors are not going to care so much about, how much you got diluted. They just want to be along for the ride. But if you really need their money, don't be scared about going up to 18 or 20%, if it's still super early for you. So this is roughly kind of where the dilution pans out for the founding team. And this is the founding team, as well as early contributors. So, based on how much you own at the outset, you could, work it back for what your individual ownership would be like. Let's see. Anonymous asks, is it common better to split into 10 million shares? I was told 100,000 based in the UK. If you're doing a UK entity, the rules slightly change. The UK has slightly different rules about receiving investment and filings. If you're a UK founder but starting a Delaware C Corp, still do 10 million. The reason why you need so many is those small grants, like a tenth of a percent to an advisor that vests over 2 to 3 years, just fall apart if you only have a couple thousand shares, because you're into a situation where like, oh, it's like, do I vest a share every other month? And it just gives you the flexibility. The number itself isn't as important as the just a large enough amount. Like if you had 5 million, fine. If you had 100 million, fine. Your shares are just going to be bigger. It's not the count, it's how much ownership they represent. All right. Elias also saying they didn't do 10 million when they set the company up. Only had 10,000 shares. This is pretty common at S Corp. Da, 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 da. All right. So, should you have more shares for your S Corp? Is it an easy process? So, first, slicing. S Corps are not actually an entity type. So, you want to take a look at what your underlying entity is. An S Corp is a tax election you can make every year for an LLC or a C Corp that changes how the entity is taxed. So, if you're a C Corp and you take an S Corp election, you get taxed more like an LLC, which means it passes through to you as an individual. You just handle your individual income taxes based on the expenses or the income of the business. The problem with an S corp election is a couple fold. One, it limits the amount of shareholders you can have under 100. You can only have US shareholders. You can't have business entities on your cap table. A lot of angel investors who are professional invest through a business entity to keep all their stuff in order. And so that's kind of a no-go for them. And there's a big funny thing called QSBS, which I'm surprised I didn't get into, but I will do a little bit here, that is questionably invalidated by being an S corp. So there is a tax gain. I remember before, back in the beginning, I said the capital gains is what you want to pay on those big gains, right? The reason you file the 83B election, the reason why you do an indelible stock grant to yourself and your founding teams, and the reason why you don't want to take any kind of income from that is eventually you'll pay yourself a salary, whatever makes sense. But when you sell your company, you're going to get big money for those shares. And there's a thing called qualified small business stock, QSBS, which entitles each shareholder in a C Corp that is a C Corp for sufficiently all of a 5-year holding period that doesn't transfer the shares between anybody else, that's the original holder of the shares. When they sell those shares in an IPO or an acquisition, they are entitled to up to $10 million of tax-free gains where capital gains don't apply. And so that's $10 million, which is very important to angel investors who are invested in dozens, if not almost 100 companies over a couple decade of investing. They get that bonus for each company. And you, as the founder, that's life-changing amounts of money that you don't have to pay tax on. So S Corp elections invalidate QSBS status as far as anybody can tell. There's not a lot of case law on this because usually people who do S Corp elections aren't actually building high growth companies, or they're getting advice, or they finally meet a startup lawyer that tells them to scrap it all and start over. But that is one of the biggest things to look out for S Corps. So is it a fairly easy process to change yourself? Not fairly easy, but not impossible. So all you have to do is amend your charter. And so a charter amendment is something you file with Delaware. You have to pay a couple $100s to do it. You have to do the work ahead of time. So the board has to approve it. If you are a C Corp, the shareholders have to approve it. And then you prep a charter amendment that fits Delaware standards. You can download on the website. We can actually help you out with it too. And it's a very funny document because it's like a find and replace on your corporate charter. It says in section 2, where it said blank, I now want it to say blank, and everybody approved it. And you do that and you change your authorized share count. LAS, in your situation, you might be able to save your butt even if you've been doing years of S Corp elections, because if you shoot your shares up to 10 million or 20 million or 50 million and you redo ownership and redo grants, to get the percentages that make sense, those would be new grants. And if you don't do any S Corp elections after that, they would count the clock for the QSBS holding period, et cetera. And that is one way. It's kind of an expensive and a painful way to do it. But if you do mess up the grants, like say you and your co-founder came in, you both gave each other 5 million shares, you never filed your 83B elections, you just didn't ignore all that stuff, you can go back to the drawing board and say, all right, let's do a charter amendment. Let's bump this up to 100 million. Now those 5 million grants are actually a very tiny part of the ownership of the company. So now we each grant ourselves 40 million and, 30 million and whatever. Consult a lawyer if you're in that position though, because it might be cheaper just to dissolve the thing if everybody's good actors and they just made mistakes, and start a brand new one and save on all the fees and the filing and the even explaining that complexity in your corporate history to potential investors and other people that joined. Ahmed, I think I answered the only founder question. If you haven't issued any shares yet, do it because of that 5-year holding period. Even if it's just the 5 million and you don't know what else is going to happen, you want to start that clock eventually, and you don't want to wait years and years and years and get into the complexities of that. Like I said, you can change things in the future if you need to. Anonymous asks, are you vesting during the cliff? No. The cliff is meant to be like the first point. So what you do is you do get all the shares that would have vested had there not been a cliff. So in the most common position of 4 years with a 1-year cliff, 25% of the grant is covered on that cliff. So by the time you hit your year anniversary, you have vested 25% of your overall grant. But if you leave at month 11 and a half, you get nothing. So the importance of the cliff is to really provide that proving period to be sure that everything is working out and your contributions match up as necessary. The 83B is based stock issuance, not authorization. Correct. So the 83B clock, the 30-day clock starts at the grant date. So if you're using good docs like through Gus Launch, we allow you to either make the grant effective as of the counterparty signature, which is the grantee, or some date in the future that you can set. So sometimes people say like, hey, you're going to start in a month, but like, let's sign all the documents here. You can't backdate it. Do not try to backdate stock grants. You're going to get yourself into a world of hurt. Try not to backdate documents at all. You can do a lot of what is acknowledging corporate actions that were legitimate, but not documented with forward-looking agreements. So if you have a good lawyer and you did a bunch of stuff and you didn't actually memorialize it, you can always do a board action that says like these people meant to do this or did this at this time, and we're acknowledging that that was done, but you do not want to try and make your corporate history fungible by like backdating things and pretending things were signed before they're signed. As silly as it sounds, when even small people are involved, as soon as something is valuable, people get really ruthless. So having a very clean corporate history is in the best interest of everybody. But to your direct question, Elias, the 83B clock only starts on the grant date, which will either be the day that you sign it or a date set in the document itself, not when they're authorized or when you set up your company in Delaware. So if 18 months later you find somebody that you want to grant stock to, their 83B election window only starts as soon as they sign the doc. Anonymous asks, what tools do we have to help founders model how the cap table will change when the safe offers are exercised? Yeah, so equity.gust.com. You have to link it with your Gust account. That's a DIY cap table thing. You can play around with it. You can create safes, convertible notes. You can model rounds. I think I actually had a demonstration of here. You can see this is just a screenshot, but if you arrowed down on these little sections, like after option pool creation, after note conversion, you will see the ownership changing based on the mechanisms that you set up in those notes. I advise people to play around with equity as like a DIY spreadsheet to just have fun. But Gust Launch is your it's your immutable ledger. It's not running on blockchain technology, but it's literally like no transaction shows up in your cap table that isn't backed up by signed and countersigned documents. So use tools to play around with modeling, but then when you actually do this stuff and execute the agreements, do it through a platform like ours. Those are still called secondaries, David. That was at 308. So I'm guessing what you're talking about is selling shares secondarily. This does happen, and because companies are staying private much longer than they used to be, I get inundated with emails from companies like Fundrise or Start Engine or Carta just got in a ton of trouble for being kind of creepy about this. But once a company is big enough in value, even though they're private, think of like Stripe. There is a second market for the shares that are given to owners. If you think about it, like you could have worked for Stripe, 7 years ago, fully vested your entire grants, even if you were just a, engineer level one, you still might be sitting on extremely valuable stock options. And there are secondary platforms out there that allow employees to sell it. Most companies that do things right do not want that to get out of hand. So again, like Gust Launch, we have transfer restrictions on all the common shares that you grant and even the stock options because the company does not want the free exchange of its shares on even a secondary market because it sets the value of the company and how much it's worth. And that can be damaging if it's not done by a professional or that can put weird market signals out there. So for the earliest times, usually you don't want any of secondary transactions taking place. Once you're a very substantial company, a household name like Stripe, it can happen. The best way it's to happen is the company itself works with a platform to basically allow companies to get some liquidity by saying, hey, this we're going to facilitate an exchange. We're either going to maybe buy them back directly from our founders, or we're going to take a big chunk of outstanding equity and make it available on a secondary marketplace. So some of our employees, early contributors can get liquidity, other people can get on the cap table that feel like we're still, we still have a lot of growth to go and, but they weren't allowed to buy shares when we were, because they never worked for us or whatever. But you pretty much always want to be working through an intermediary there because there's tax consequences. You want lawyers involved. You can mess up the company books, things like that. Sunday, yes, sessions recorded. We will send out a link to both the materials that I'm going through here and the recording, hopefully tomorrow, maybe Monday. And let me go through the chat, and then I think I can wrap it up right at the 15. Mercy, could we get those results to the data room or just for internal use for the startup corporate diligence report? The results from the corporate diligence report will definitely be most helpful for you to get your data room into good shape. If you do get like the 100%, everything looks awesome. We haven't really broadcast that to investors yet, but we actually do make the tool available to investors as well, and we encourage them to use it. We're trying to grow new angel investors through something we call the Gust Angel Collective, which is tapping into people who aren't like septuagenarians, who made all their money in like the 80s or the 90s, but people who've worked in the economy in the last 15 to 20 years who have made well for themselves. Like there's a lot of untapped capital out there from people who don't even know that they're accredited investors, and they could be putting, a portion of their investing into startups and fostering more growth and innovation in the economy. So we're trying to grow those investors and we're giving them that corporate diligence report being like, hey, if you're evaluating a company and you're not super familiar with the corporate structure because you haven't done this 30 times, like this tool can be useful for you as well. So I would actually say I haven't thought about it. But if you run through it and you like the results of it, sharing it with investors or putting it in your data rooms probably not a terrible idea. If you're working with sophisticated investors, it might seem a little naive because they should already know this stuff. So maybe not leading with it, but if it's something where people start asking questions about your corporate structure, you can maybe at least use it to back up your argument, if not show them what you put out. Do. This is a great one, Marina. Past date vesting if you've already been working on the company for a year. So this is a very nuanced point that do not backdate anything. Like I said, don't backdate a grant, don't backdate a corporate action. But when you're doing a grant that's new, but you've already been working in the company, and to the previous question, like what if I haven't granted myself shares yet? This happens a lot. A lot of solo founders get themselves an entity and they just don't know what to grant themselves. They want a co-founder, they're not sure. Like I said before, I would encourage you to do a grant because you do not have the corporate veil established if you don't have shareholders in a C Corp. So a C Corp requires directors, officers, and shareholders in order to have liability protection. If it doesn't have all three of those bodies, it can be considered a sham corporation that is like set up just to protect somebody from doing something wrong, to try and skate liability. You're obviously not trying to do that, but the technicalities of the law require shareholders. So get yourself a shareholder. However, if you've been doing this for 2 years and you just didn't, you know, it was just you, why, how much do I grant? Wait till somebody come on wrong. Not the end of the world. I would get your grant covered, but you can backdate the vesting start date. You don't backdate the date of the grant, but you can literally say, hey, this has been going for 24 months. So I'm halfway through my vesting schedule. If you backdate it all the way to the point where you only have like 3 months worth of vesting, I don't know what signal that's really going to send to investors. They're probably going to just be like, you should revest because like now my money's going to work and I want to be sure you're here. So don't get too nervous about it. But it's most useful for like if you've been doing something for 6 or 9 months or a year and you've been really at it, you just, we're kind of waiting to make the call. Backdating it, to compensate for that can make a lot of sense. And that gets you Elias 2. I talked about the YC safe. And great. All right. I think we're good. I think I actually got through all the Q&A. Only spent 18 extra minutes of my afternoon. Thank you very much for joining me for this. I always go a little long if I don't have a shepherd over here to to tell me to speed up. But thanks for the bunch of you that stayed for the additional Q&A. Check out all the cool stuff that we do. Honestly, we're helping founders every day. We're clearing this stuff up. Like I said, mission control is just a great way to put your foot in the pond and learn and learn and learn. And then you'll see if the other stuff that we have is relevant to you. This could be anything from starting a new company, migrating an existing one, or converting an LLC, or even just pitching to our angel group if you're at the stage of the traction that we actually invest in. Don't pitch to it willy-nilly. Don't shoot your shot. If you're an idea stage only company, applying to organized groups is usually not worth it, but mission control will help you out figure out where your likely sources of capital are, or what traction you need to demonstrate before investors will be interested. We do pitch reviews, we do financial model reviews, and we just help founders, where they're at. And it's a ton of fun and very rewarding for all involved. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your week, and I'm sure I'll see you on another webinar soon.